I went to the garden of love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst, where I used to play on the green. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. So I turned to the garden of love that so many sweet flowers bore, and I saw it was filled with graves, and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds, and binding with briars my joys and desires.
William Blake was a famous poet, painter, and engraver of the late 18th century and early 19th century. Blake was a radical, anti-authority figure. William Blake was born at 28 Broad Street in Soho, London on 28 November 1757. His father James Blake was a hosier. He and his wife Catherine had 6 children. Apart from William, they had 4 boys and 1 girl. From an early age, William Blake was artistic. He also had visions of things like angels. When he was 14, William was made apprentice to an engraver called James Bossier. William served 7 years and became an engraver himself in 1779. Blake also wanted to paint, and the same year he became a student at the Royal Academy of Arts. On 18 August 1782, William Blake married Catherine Sophia Boucher at the Church of St. Mary in Battersea. Blake also wrote poems. A book of poems called Poetical Sketches was published in 1783. In 1789 he published a book of poems called The Song of Innocence. In 1825 Blake was commissioned to illustrate Divine Comedy by Dante, but he died before he could complete the task. William Blake died on 12 August 1827. He was buried in Bunhill Fields in London. His genius was only truly recognized after his death. The distortion of Christian belief about the future life. Blake attacks the approach of some forms of contemporary Christianity which encourage the denial of sexuality and other powers in the present in the hope of future reward and bliss. He felt that this led to permanent failure to attain human fulfillment. The effects of fallenness on repression of sexuality and other emotions. Blake believed that inhibitions lie primarily within the mind rather than in external factors. Society makes its fears, guilt and shame into rules and laws which are then enshrined in social institutions such as the authority of parents, the church and the state or monarchy. The poem is the antithesis to the echoing green of Innocence, as it uses the same setting and rhythm to stress the ugly contrast. Blake firmly believed that love cannot be sanctified by religion. The negative commandments of the Old Testament, thou shalt not, could not enshrine the most positive creative force on earth. For Blake, sexuality and instinct is holy. The world of institutionalized religion turns this instinct into imprisonment and engenders hypocrisy. Those rules, which forbid the celebration of the body, kill life itself. In this poem, the speaker describes revisiting a place he remembers from his childhood, only to find that it has been taken over by a chapel or church. He is prevented from entering, so he attempts to explore the surrounding garden instead. Here he finds that the place which used to be full of sweet flowers, line 8, has been filled with graves and tombstones instead. In addition, patrolling priests, in their dark robes, prevent him from experiencing or reliving his joys and desires, line 12. This poem could be interpreted in different ways. On one level it is simply a mark of the passage of time, and that as a result of human expansion, an open area of his childhood no longer exists. While this is cause for dismay for the speaker, it is surely not particularly surprising. However, the fact that it is a religious building that has usurped this land could imply a broader comment on organized religion and its influence on innocent pleasures and freedom. The speaker visits a garden that he had frequented in his youth, only to find it overrun with briars, symbols of death in the form of tombstones, and close-minded clergy. The Garden of Love is a deceptively simple 3-stanza poem made up of quatrains. The first 2 quatrains follow Blake's typical ABCB rhyme scheme, with the final stanza breaking the rhyme to ABCD. The lack of rhyme in the last stanza, which also contains the longest lines, serves to emphasize the death and decay that have overtaken a place that once used to hold such life and beauty for the speaker. Following the specific examples of flowers representing types of love, this poem paints a broader picture of flowers in a garden as the joys and desires of youth. When the speaker returns to the Garden of Love, he finds a chapel built there with the words, "Thou shalt not" written overhead. The implication is that organized religion is intentionally forbidding people from enjoying their natural desires and pleasures. The speaker also finds the garden given over to the graves of his pleasures, while black-clad priest binds his joys and desires in thorns. This not-so-subtle critique shows Blake's frustration at a religious system that would deny men the pleasures of nature and their own instinctive desires. He sees religion as an arm of modern society in general, with its demand that human beings reject their created selves to conform to a more mechanistic and materialistic world. The dominant image evokes two gardens in the Old Testament. Firstly, it evokes the Garden of Eden before the fall of humankind. When Adam and Eve were in the garden, they were able to love without shame and self-consciousness. It was a place, therefore, of innocent, uninhibited sexual expression. The state of the garden discovered by the speaker is therefore akin to Eden after the fall, when sexuality is surrounded by shame, repression and prohibitions. The second garden is found in the Old Testament poem, the Song of Songs. This is an unashamedly erotic poem in which garden imagery is used as a metaphor for sexual enjoyment. However, the contemporary Christian reading reinterpreted the original eroticism of the poem to make it a symbol of a purer spiritual love, implicitly demoting the worth of sexuality. The green. The color green is associated with growth, fertility and spring. Village greens were places of play and freedom. They represented the importance of play, and therefore of imagination, in human life. Village greens were not owned by anyone, so represented freedom from the rule or demands of an authority figure. In the Songs of Innocence, the green is a place of play and freedom for children. It evokes a time of innocence in which play could include innocent, unself-conscious sexuality. Here it has been taken over by oppressiveness. The chapel. It is bounded by gates which are shut. It is a place where people are not free to act, thou shalt not. It is associated with the loss of life, graves. Its priests wear uniforms, they are all in black, and patrol the grounds like warders. They confine any initiative toward freedom, binding, desires, in a potentially painful way, using briars. Here, in this poem, the poet rebels against the idea of original sin. Man was expelled for eating of the fruit of knowledge and, cast out of Eden, was shamed by sexuality. In the poem, the poet subverts orthodoxy and the patriarchal authority figures of the Father and God and his priests. The dissenting tradition to which Blake's family belonged believed in inner light and the kingdom within. Moral laws without any rationale are not to be obeyed. In the Garden of Love, interfering priesthood and the powers of prohibition blight innocent affections. The Church of Experience, like the king and state, rely on such powers to ensure obedience. A contemporary reference linked with the poem is that of the Marriage Act of 1753, passed by Lord Hardwicke. These acts stipulated that all marriages had to be solemnized according to the rules of the Church of England in the parish church of one of the parties in the presence of a clergyman and two witnesses. With the loss of rural society and extended families in villages, this legislation was perhaps necessary, especially in urban centers. However, for Blake this was equal to curbing individual freedom. For him, each prohibition created repression. Therefore, in the Garden of Love, we see a bleak, unproductive landscape of unfulfilled yearning where sterile resentment, fear, guilt and joylessness replace the open freedom of innocence. The 12 lines of the William Blake's poem The Garden of Love belong to the state of experience that characterizes the present-day world. Experience stands in total contrast to the state of innocence. The poetry visited the Garden of Love, open green piece of land, where he used to play with other boys and girls. He was dismayed to see there what he had never seen earlier. He found that in the green open place, a chapel, church, had been erected in the middle of the place where boys and girls used to play. Institutionalized religion thus destroyed the Garden of Love. In the world of experience, the harmony between man and nature no longer existed. Earlier the Garden of Love seemed to be in state of idyllic beauty, but the present-day scenario of the place is one of utter sadness and gloom. The speaker visits a happy place from his past, a garden where he played as a child. Perhaps his intention was to relive some of those fond memories. The tone is almost dreamlike as the speaker describes the disturbing changes he discovers. This simple narration and the use of powerful symbols, such as flowers and tombstones, creates a mood almost of horror, as he gradually realizes how the joyful place of his memory has been transformed into a place of death and oppression. The chapel serves as a symbol of organized religion. It shows how the personal relationship between man and God have become restricted by rules and structures. Blake thought that the institution may have become more important than the purpose of religion. The relationship between man and God have become restricted and perhaps artificial. Man and his rules have even infiltrated the world of children. A world where the innocence from children have been taken away and replaced by rules and restrictions. In the second stanza, the poet gives further description of the place of his revisit. The gates of the chapel were closed. And the closed door had got written on it, "Thou shalt not." So, the visitor, the poet, turned his attention to the place of the garden of love, where it used to bloom a number of flowers, but found them missing. In fact, the very idea of chapel in the negative "thou shalt not" suggests the concept of private property, which is the source of all inequality and helplessness in society. The gate is closed to the passerby, and on it is inscribed the warning "thou shalt not." The warning is emblematic of the classic dictum of the Old Testament God Jehovah, who is seen as a prohibitive and a vindictive tyrant. The connotation of a closed gate creates a sense of exclusion. It clearly says, "Play by our rules." The innocence of the garden from his past is replaced by restrictions. The words above the door clearly states the restrictions. "Thou shalt not." The speaker is hoping that the rest of the garden did not change. However, the garden was replaced by a somber cemetery. The flowers serve as a symbol of his innocence and is not impacted on by society and the rules that are attached by society to this emotion that have infused it with a cynicism that is not in keeping with true love. The lines of the third stanza depict the adverse changes that have enveloped the garden of love during the present time. The garden portrays an aura of total unease and misery. At present, the garden seems to be filled with graves and tombstones, which are images of death and so horrendous and undesirable. Even the priests wrapped in black gowns forebode an ill omen and an act of mourning and despair. The priests depict a total official manner devoid of any compassion or even forgiveness. This seems to be the basic factor that binds the narrator's desires and joy. The poet repeats "and" in every line of this stanza. It helps to build up the tone of impending doom. A fate that no one ever escapes. The garden is literally filled with graves. Figuratively, this serves as metaphor for the end of innocence and a life that will ultimately end in a grave. The clergy are all dressed in the uniforms of their institution. They are all the same and are dressed in black. The color of death. A death of their innocence. Their routine is set and inflexible. Governed by an institution that gives no thought to individual. The binding image of briars are thorny plants. Makes it difficult for the speaker to relive those moments of joy and happiness that he is looking for. The poet reinforces this image with alliteration.